Hi, I'm Mirriam, and this is Trials and Errors. Today on the show, I got to interview one of my favorite people. His name is Ken White, and you might know him as Popehat on the internet because he is very online. He wrote a blog for a number of years. I think now it's on Substack called Popehat. Has appeared on all kinds of television news programs like MSNBC, CNN, I don't know about Fox, 700 Club, Joel Osteen, which is his favorite ever. You gonna leave that in there?
Yeah, of course I am. Yeah.
Okay. And that's defamation, libel slander. Ken is known for RICO. He's also a well-known First Amendment lawyer, and we talk about how he went from being a U.S. attorney to the bright side. So settle in and enjoy part one. My question is obliquely about the forbidden topic. How does he genuinely feel about being that guy that everyone tags for that thing? Or do you like it? Do you have some pride in it? And we'll talk about what that thing is
Sure.
in a minute. But how do you feel about it?
Look, I've got no one to blame but myself for this, right?
Sure.
I lean into it because, just like any of these, it just sort of snowballs. I wrote something about how it's not RICO and it's never RICO because I dealt with it and I knew that it wasn't. And then people would note that and say something about it, and I'd say something back, and pretty soon, 10 more people were bringing it up, and then it became a thing, and more until now. Yeah, honestly, sometimes it's a little bit tough. RICO hits the news, and all of a sudden, there's like 500 people tagging me on Twitter to tell me about the news about RICO. It becomes hard just to read the tweets,
Right.
which maybe is a good thing. It drives me away from Twitter for a while.
It
But
is a bit.
so
It's a bit crazy.
it is, but here's the thing. The reason I think I make it a thing and a shtick or a gimmick is that to me, it sort of encapsulates some of my issues with how we deal with legal issues and criminal justice issues in the media and in social media and that type of thing. How people have these very ingrained views about how it works and what's important and what's really a thing. And a lot of the time, they're not reality based, and the media pushes them. So RICO is a good example because RICO is just like, it's like an emoji or an exclamation point that people use to indicate this is really bad or important.
Right.
And I'm not a huge fan of that because it's actually, it is a real thing with real legal limits. A lot of the time, this comes from the same place that makes me infuriated when people say literally and mean figuratively, and gets me sort of old man grumpy. So I think that I like to say, these legal terms do actually have meaning. And if it were completely harmless that we use them like that we don't, I guess I wouldn't care, but it's not harmless. And these legal terms can be used in a way that's colloquial that actually makes us less well informed about important civic issues and civil rights. And so, RICO is just one example. RICO, when you invoke RICO, isn't this RICO, big daddy government, come to save me from this complicated situation, right? Like RICO is the Deus ex machina that's going to come down from the clouds and somehow fix this incredibly complicated social political issue. And, I'm here to tell you it's not.
Right.
Uh, RICO is not like, the magic wand that somehow resolves the problem that you've got tons of idiots storming the Capitol because they think that a satanic child abuse conspiracy overturned the presidential election. A statute's not going to fix that.
And I don't know if it's different in California. And you were a U.S. attorney, so I don't know the
Right.
extent to which your office used RICO. So
Not very often.
Okay.
And I know you've mentioned that you've observed it being used against street gangs.
A lot.
And in my experience, when you stray away from the classic, what the statute was designed for, which is, literal organized crime, going after people whose middle name is the other uses tend to be concerning and less admirable. So I don't know that the street gang uses of RICO are particularly a demonstration of something we like or that we should encourage, because they pretty much are trying to find a way to criminalize being a black or brown kid that the cops think must be in a gang, which, as you know, is usually for completely bogus reasons. So when people say, but it could be RICO because look how they use it on gangs. And I'd say, yeah, look how they use it on gangs. That's exactly why you don't want it used broadly in this sort of unprincipled, if there's a problem, let's call RICO sort of way that people suggest, because that's a way basically is trying to criminalize association, trying to criminalize hanging out on the street corner with three of your friends and all of you are poor.
Right. That's exactly how we see it used in my jurisdiction.
Right.
Literally a neighborhood, a block of people who hang out are then called a racketeering enterprise, a corrupted organization. But what about terrorism? Because a huge section of what is considered racketeering, right? Racketeering acts are specifically designed for terrorism, but only international terrorism.
What I try to teach young lawyers who have the severe misfortune to be supervised by me is to, make things simpler when possible. And RICO is just gratuitously overcomplicated. I don't know why you would want to if there are cleaner, more straightforward ways to do it. I'm already leery about the whole concept of domestic terrorism because I think that it's not actually that broadening domestic terror laws is not actually going to result in fewer lunatics trying to blow up Congress. I think it's going to be used against Black Lives Matter and Antifa and whatever you want. I mean, right now there's cases going on in Arizona where they're trying to use terrorism and street gang analogs to go after protesters. I'm not thrilled with that. Having actually prosecuted terrorism stuff, I think there are existing tools that work perfectly well. So why would you want to trot out this, it's like Mousetrap from the game Mousetrap, right? Where the entire joke is that it's overly complicated and that's why it's so hard to put this Rube Goldberg device together on your board and win the game. I'm now dating myself. I don't know if that board game.
No, my kids do
anymore.
it. My kids had to actually do one for school. Yeah.
Right. And the joke is how hard it is to do, right? And how ridiculously over the top it is.
Yeah.
And that's what RICO is. And you look at something where, like the attack on Congress, where, you've got a perfectly good seditious conspiracy statute. It's simple. It's straightforward. I mean, simple within the context of gigantic country altering events like this. But you don't have to have all these factors and wacky things with all this controversial legal stuff about it. I think people mistake wanting an effective tool with wanting a charge that conveys how strongly they feel about it. So RICO, when you say RICO is the charge that, it's the way to say, oh no, I strenuously object. It's like, no, we're just charging him.
You bang the table, right?
Right. We're charging him with something serious. We're charging him with RICO. That's how bad they are.
But can you talk about how, from my perspective, RICO is an everyday charge, right? I mean, it gets charged all the time, but seditious conspiracy, that's special, right?
Right. Well, from your perspective, it gets charged every day in this specific context of criminal street gangs, or alleged criminal street gangs, right? So that's one way they have used it. And really, they've used it that way to get around the necessity of proving that, somebody did something.
Right. Exactly.
Besides being standing there and being brown and having a red shirt on. RICO's use is when you don't have any other tools that will reach the conduct you're mad about. And that's not necessarily a good thing, as we see in its abuse against street gangs to go after kids who are just, again, hanging out with friends in their neighborhood. Seditious conspiracy, it's simpler. Yeah, you have to show that it's trying to violently interfere with the operation of the government. But to me, that's easier than this whole this whole racketeering idea and this whole idea of an enterprise and conduct of the enterprise and predicate acts and all this complicated stuff.
Well, don't you think that it's possible that, groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters could qualify under RICO?
If you could show them engaged in the business of doing criminal acts, specified criminal acts under the statute. And, people need to focus on the idea that RICO has specified predicate acts. It's not just any violation of the law. It has to be one of the ones that's listed. So, you could build a case for it. But again, I'm not wild about increasing its use good old boring, Title 18, Section 371, plain vanilla conspiracy. And use that to connect people with specified federal crimes. The government does that every day with a wide variety of crimes, anything from drugs to bank robbery to fraud to whatever it is. And because it requires you to really to tie it to a specific criminal act by the particular person, it doesn't run this risk of criminalizing membership in whatever group is disfavored at the moment.
I think I agree with you.
Here's some of my sensibility about this is actually related to the anti-terrorism laws. So, long time ago, 1999, I worked on and I got one of the first convictions in the United States under the federal law banning rendering aid to a designated foreign terrorist organization. Okay. And that's a statute like John Walker Lind, if you remember him,
Right.
the kid who went overseas. A few other have been convicted under. It's controversial. And this was a guy who I convicted who was running an immigration place in Los Angeles that was falsifying immigration documents and making up fake asylum stories to bring in people, including members of the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, who are an Iranian group. At the time, they were designated as a foreign terrorist organization, even though there were forces who thought, no, they're anti-Iranian regime. They're not really, they're the type of terrorists we like. They're not a foreign designated terrorist organization. So anyway, I get this guy to plead guilty to assisting this organization that's on this list. And then later, because of politics, they take them off the list. And they were still the same group. They had still killed the same people. Most of the Americans they killed were in the 70s, but they still had the same ideology. They were still dangerous in the same ways. They were taken off the list because of politics, because the politics had shifted. So I'm kind of left thinking, well, what exactly did I do there? Did I at the time I thought it was great, but now I'm sort of thinking, well, did I just convict someone of assisting a group that was politically unpopular? So I don't like the concept of statutes being used to do that. And I think RICO is more vulnerable to that than are a lot of other federal statutes. Just the way, because it's designed to get behind the structure of a organized crime, to get to the guy who's not out there, punching somebody or shaking down the small store or killing somebody.
Well, you talked about you just talked about prosecuting this person and then thinking about it later, like, what did you do? So can we talk a little bit about the mind shift between being a prosecutor and that trajectory to being who you are right now, how your thought process has changed and what made that happen? Like, what was it that kind of brought you to the light?
So, in college, I worked for the DA's office for a couple of summers, and I thought it was cool and exciting and interesting. And I got an interest in becoming a prosecutor. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. And I can't really say how reflective it actually was, as opposed to how it's just one of those things you fall into doing and then decide this is what I should do. Maybe if I'd gotten that summer job at the PD's office, I would have started out as a defense lawyer instead. But I wanted to do it. I did a few more clerkships and internships during law school, and I lucked out by getting a great recommendation by the judge I clerked for, and started out, at tender age of 26 as a federal prosecutor, which is far, far too young to have that type of power of any sort. And, I believed in the mission. That was assisted by the fact that it's a really great team of people. The camaraderie is very strong, and it really feels like a team. But I became increasingly disenchanted by some of the things I saw, just on a variety of levels, on the way it sort of ground people up, on the way that the rights that were given to criminal defendants didn't seem like substantive rights at all, sort of the one-sidedness of the system, and sort of the arbitrary nature by which we decided whether the feds were going to go after somebody and they were going to do 10 years mandatory minimum or not, and they were going to do a year in state prison, right? And it was an arbitrary thing that made it go one way or the other. And a lot of that kind of wore on me. And then generally, the feds like to consider themselves a little bit above and better than state law enforcement. And sometimes they imagine themselves as the people who ride in and rescue people, and they're from state law enforcement. And there are some good civil rights prosecutions, but the involvement of the feds in state injustice also was a problem. And so one of the things that really tripped it for me was I was on the dirty team for Rampart. So you might remember Rampart. Rampart is a division, LAPD division here in Los Angeles. You've heard it if you ever watched the old show Emergency or some of those old cop shows from the 70s. And there was this huge scandal with Rampart in which a lot of the cops were super dirty, super violent, super violating people's rights. And so when you're prosecuting cops as the feds, you have compelled testimony problems because cops generally are required as a condition to be a cop to give statements if asked by internal affairs. And if you don't, you can be fired, right? Mm-hmm. But because the cop is a government employee, that's a form of government compulsion of the statement. So it violates their Fifth Amendment rights, and you can't use it in a prosecution if it's a statement that's been compelled by saying, give the statement or we, the government, fire you. That's kind of a very short, simplified version, but that's it. So you have a dirty team who looks through evidence and makes sure that you take out any statements that are compelled and might be radioactive and Fifth Amendment protected before it gets turned over to the prosecutors who are going to run the case. So I was on the dirty team reading all these statements given in different circumstances by these guys, including this notorious cop named Rafael Perez. And Perez on one of these statements is just talking about what they would do every day. How they would just roll out and really do whatever they felt like doing, whatever made them happy. And he was talking about a call where there was a guy who's threatening suicide and is in his house saying he's going to kill himself. And Rampart rolls up and basically mocks him and ridicules him and talks him into doing it, to killing himself. And I just read that and I'm kind of like, am I on the right team? Like the meme you see online, are we the baddies?
Right.
Right. Are we the baddies? That and a few other instances I've talked about, just where, one of the things I'd see is that federal sentencing and federal procedure is very different than state sentencing and state procedure, right? And I'm sure you've seen where a state practitioner who has no business in federal court wanders in, tries to represent someone in a federal sentencing, has never seen the federal guidelines, and it's like asking a golden retriever to fill out a tax return. It's not going to work out well. So I had a case where that happened. The defendant I was prosecuting was a kid who had stolen some mail to look for stuff in it to buy meth. He was an asshole, but he wasn't a terrible human being or anything. He'd fled for a while. He should have only gotten a few months and then got out to rehab. But he had this lawyer who they paid a lot for, but had no idea what he was doing. So I found myself having to make the arguments that he should be making and then refute them. So make the argument, Your Honor, I think I understood the defense to be saying that the criminal history is overstated. It overstates how bad his record really is. And therefore you should sentence him in category 2 rather than category 3. My response to that would be, so I was having to argue both sides. And it occurred to me that if it wasn't me, probably that wouldn't happen. If it wasn't me in a good day,
right,
a really good day, I wouldn't have done it. Most of the time, I wouldn't have done it. I just would have said, okay, I'm just going to, bounce this guy's rubble. And that's not fair. And so much of the system, all these huge consequences are imposed with people who don't really have adequate representation. Where even when they have good, smart, good lawyers, those lawyers don't have the resources they need, the time they need, anything like that. And the idea that we're actually giving them zealous advocacy all the time is kind of a sham. And I just wasn't comfortable with it. I was increasingly uncomfortable with the war on drugs, having participated in it far more than I'm happy with now, looking back on. And I just thought, I'm not sure I'm working for the right team here. And I'm not sure this is the right thing to do. So
when did the switch come? Was there what was the deciding factor for you?
I don't think there was a single deciding factor, but there was kind of a season, right, in 99 and 2000. And if I'm being honest, that probably had something to do as much with untreated depression as it did with principle. So, my mom died in '98. It was a ugly process, very tough, and I did not handle it well, and I was untreated, seriously depressed. And the way I looked at things and handled these types of conundrums and these types of misgivings about the system were run through that. Who knows? 20 years later, I say, if I'd been sensibly treated for depression, would I have found a way to reconcile with being a prosecutor and been a prosecutor longer? Now I'm a true believer, though. I mean, I used to, as a kid, and I was a kid, me and the other kids would make fun of the true believer defense attorneys,
I know.
the passionate true believers with the certainty of youth. And now I'm, no question I am one.
When we learn about the law in America, and I think I've said this on a number of occasions more recently as I'm trying to kind of feel all of this stuff out. We accept the Constitution, right? And we think like, here is a document and it does all of this amazing stuff. And we can't mess with it. And what it says is the parameters of our law, which is, I mean, I guess it's true because we take it as true and we have decided not to change it or amend it or have a new constitution or add a lot of new amendments to it. Whereas other countries will. They'll be like, well, this Constitution doesn't work anymore. Let's make a new one.
Right.
So when you talk about the First Amendment, a lot of the things that you write are very much not, and you say it too, right? It's not about what we think the law should be, but what the facts are, what the law actually is. But our law is it's a racist document. I mean, it just is, right? It's not designed for Black Americans. I don't even think it fathomed Muslim Americans, right? Indigenous people, like this whole idea of, well, we can't ban hate speech because the First Amendment says we can't, or it will be used against people like me when it already is.
Right.
It already is. It's not that we have this law that is not used by this idea of the First Amendment being a amendment that can't be touched because it provides us with so many freedoms. And it really, I mean, it kind of really doesn't. I mean, as long as the free speech portion of it. I mean, we can talk about, religion and everything else at some later point, but.
You see, I don't know what you mean by saying that it's a racist document, or I do in the historical sense. It's grounded in a history of racism. The people who did it had racist ideas. It's been used for racist ends. But if you were to say something specific, like is it racist to say that Congress can't single out and declare somebody convicted? No bills of attainder. Is the concept of no bills of attainder racist? Yet, no, I don't think so. Does the First Amendment protect racist speech? Absolutely. It protects it as a subset of other speech. So if you think that the purpose of it is just so we can protect the racist speech, I'm not sure history or practice plays that out. I mean, if you look at the exceptions to the First Amendment, so in the cases where the Supreme Court says that here are the very few exceptions we've recognized, they're all built on the backs, not of white people, but on the backs of religious, political, ethnic minorities. Fighting words, that's Jehovah's Witnesses. A lot of the speech and assembly stuff, that's civil rights protesters. A lot of the stuff that would lead to fire.
Said they didn't have a First Amendment right? And then so they had to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, right? Who can then decide either you do or you don't.
But what I'm saying is when the government tries to suppress speech, it's disproportionately always going to be the people with the least power. And even if it's well-intentioned that we're passing this for good reasons. So did you see the thing about the hate speech law in the town in Pennsylvania, the city in Pennsylvania, that would use, using racially offensive epithets in an aggressive way, get somebody? So one color accounted for 50% of the 16 people who were prosecuted under the law in the first year. Would you like to guess the color?
Who?
Blue. 50% of the cases were about using racist epithets to cops by homeless people or drunks or suits.
Right.
And this is always the way it works.
Right.
Okay,
Because
so
that's what America does.
yeah, so my question is this. I mean, the First Amendment has been, the development of it has been crucial. They built exceptions to go after socialists objecting to the draft, and it took a long time to fight back that exception and narrow it from the the tendency to do harm test to this uh, to the Brandenburg test, to speech that has to be intended and likely to cause imminent lawless action. And that's good, because without that, then all sorts of speech by powerless people could still be prosecuted, actually absolutely would be. I mean, you look at the people who are so thirsty right now to go after Black Lives Matter and Antifa. They want to make Antifa a RICO, and they don't put it much more sophisticated than that. You've got state legislature passing laws making it easier to run people over if they block you in a protest. You have them passing laws making it easier for students to get kicked out of public universities if they heckle Milo Yiannopoulos or some other asshole right-wing speaker who shows up, right? And they call that in favor of free speech. So to me, there is absolutely nothing in the history of the First Amendment that supports the notion that making more exceptions is going to work against white supremacy as opposed to in favor of white supremacy. It just doesn't work that way. But on the other hand,
live with it, right?
You do have to live with it, and it's not cost-free.
Right.
So
it's the thing. It's that you have to live with it because people like make fun of you, like Michael Avenatti, right?
That's actually kind of fun. But right. I recognize, I get some abuse about having depression or stuff like that. Nothing compared to people who are Black or gay or Muslim or whatever it is. One of the things that's about current so-called free speech culture dialogue right now that I think does not reflect well on the left, does not reflect well on the right, is this notion that somehow people shouldn't feel just as free to call out racism as they feel to be racist, right? Yeah, this cancel culture thing. I think 95% of cancel culture complaints amount to you made me feel bad for saying something. And to me, look, the cancel culture is free speech. The canceling is just as much speech as the thing they're trying to cancel. So I may disagree with their take on the speech, with their critique of it, just like I might disagree with the speech. But I think the cancel culture movement, this critique, is trying to sort of to regulate the marketplace of ideas. We tell people that, okay, here's the deal. No, we're not going to arrest the guy who yells racial slurs at you, and you can't sue him. But the deal is you can enter the marketplace of ideas and respond to them. And then if you do, it's but not like that. And to me,
we do that because we have social media, right?
Right.
we were never able to do that before. We just had to take it.
Sure. And now people don't like the fact. People don't like the fact that, people can impose social consequences very easy. And sometimes those social consequences are ugly and, to my taste, unfair or disproportionate or wrong-headed, but then so is a lot of the speech it's responding to. So I think there's this effort to create this sort of speech culture that says that you have to be nice to someone who speaks, and that the first speaker is somehow in a different plane, a more privileged plane than anyone criticizing and responding to them. That doesn't make sense to me.
Well, but I think it's true, right? Because usually the people that are complaining about being critiqued are privileged. They are on a more privileged plane, and their complaint is, why are you people saying anything about what I'm saying? So basically what's happened is marginalized communities have gotten together and said, with the help of people who know how to find out where people live or where they work or whatever else, and said, okay, nobody else is going to protect us. We're just going to go. It's truly mob mentality.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the government doing it. We've just taken matters into our own hands.
But, if the Proud Boys marching around yelling slogans is free speech. So is a group of people who hate the Proud Boys marching around on Twitter, naming and shaming people.
The feelings are very different, right? And I understand that sometimes we don't have the ability on this side to be completely rational and reasonable and principled all the time because the impact is so strong a lot of the time.
Right.
So it's hard to kind of walk that, let's be fair to everybody line all the time.
And it's fair to ask when people sort of tone police, let's say someone criticizes something they think is racist, and someone comes in and sort of tone polices it. Did you have to call them out like that? Did you have to do it in public on Twitter? Did you have to, just say they were racist instead of explaining why you found what they said to be offensive? Couldn't you have done it a better way? Sometimes my reaction is, okay, but did you police the thing they were responding to? Did you tone police that? So if you're interested in the project of being a tone policer, are you going to point that at everybody or just some people? Okay. So if you're only going to tone police people who are criticizing racists, well, I mean, you've made a choice there. Don't pretend you haven't made a choice.
The worse than being a racist is being called a racist. Racist all day long, just don't say that I am.
Yeah, I mean, I get called a racist and a Nazi and that sort of thing, and I'm not fond of it, but I guess I don't have the level of self-seriousness necessary to think it's as bad as actually having racial slurs shouted at me.
I didn't get Michael Avenatti calling me, but you did.
Well, did you criticize him openly?
Probably.
Because, I mean, he had a history of calling people who said something about him. And,
he called a fairly new immigration attorney.
Right.
And just right after he called you, I think.
Yeah, I know, because he's a disturbed narcissistic freak.
Yeah.
I mean, he told, the show American Greed that they did the episode on him recently that I was on. I didn't find out until they aired that show that Michael Avenatti told this show, which is a real thing, like, on CNBC. Oh, I won't do an interview with you unless you agree to ditch Ken White's interview. And it was, it reminded me, didn't that happen with like We Are the World? You remember We Are the World for World Hunger? Didn't like Prince wouldn't do it unless they kicked out Michael Jackson, or maybe vice versa. It was kind of like that.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, but how many major lawsuits have you won? How many $1 million lawsuits have you won?
Yeah, how many $1 million verdicts?
I'm sorry, I don't know anything about civil law. How many $1 million verdicts have you got?
Well, he's incredibly narcissistic and to a disturbed extent, and that's very much, he can't handle, like many narcissists, being made fun of or criticized, and it's very much sort of it's a point of honor. How could you possibly say something bad about me when I'm so clearly the superior person?
He was going to run for president.
Well, I don't know whether he really was, but that was not any part of the media's greatest hour, taking that even remotely seriously. So if you look at the fawning coverage of him early on, it is really pretty embarrassing. People accuse me of being too soft on him, and what I usually said actually was, well, I mean, he's had legal successes in the courtroom, so to that extent, he's a good lawyer, and he's effective at being this media figure. Time will tell whether that actually works well in his cases. So I think that prediction worked out fairly well, but
he took it a step too far.
Yeah, if you're going to extort anyone, it probably shouldn't be the lawyers who can call the director of the FBI directly on the first call.
Not advice you give.
No, I would be a pro tip against that.
Thank you so much. I took up a lot of your.
It was my pleasure. I'm looking forward to watching more of this show because I have to say that I admire how much you tell it like it is about the system, and you're part of it and what you see, and that you're not afraid to call out and disagree with people, for want of a better term, on your side, on the criminal justice defense side, and point out that there's sort of things you're not supposed to say, even among criminal defense attorneys. They're sacred cows among them as much as among anyone. And I really like your willingness to call that stuff out and to call it like you see it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Trials and Errors with Ken White. Remember, subscribe, hit the notification icon so that you'll know when part 2 comes out next week. Thanks. Bye.